Sienna violently threw the plastic garment bag across the luxurious bridal suite, her face flushed with pure, unfiltered rage. The cheap, yellowed thrift store dress spilled out onto the pristine white carpet, looking completely absurd next to the imported silk gowns surrounding them. "You completely ruined my wedding," Sienna screamed, tears of furious entitlement running down her face as she pointed a trembling finger at her older sister Cora. "I asked you for one thing, Cora. One designer dress. But you are so incredibly cheap and selfish that you couldn't even do this for me." Cora stood quietly in the center of the room, fighting back her own heavy tears. She didn't yell back. She simply reached into the pocket of her faded cardigan, gripping a crumpled, secretly paid-off bank statement. Cora had just drained her entire life savings to give her sister a priceless, life-changing gift, but Sienna was too blinded by a superficial price tag to realize what her older sister had actually sacrificed. Welcome back to Moments and Meanings. Before we uncover the heartbreaking twist in today's story, take a quick moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment down below if you believe that true family is worth more than any designer label. In a world utterly obsessed with aesthetics and picture-perfect weddings, it's so easy to lose sight of what truly matters. We judge our loved ones by the expensive gifts they hand us wrapped in pretty bows, completely ignoring the massive, silent sacrifices they make for us behind closed doors. Today, we are diving into a deeply emotional story about an entitled bride who violently humiliated her hard-working older sister over a cheap, used dress. But she had absolutely no idea the devastating secret her sister was hiding, and the life-altering sacrifice that cheap dress actually represented. Get ready for a story that will completely change how you view the meaning of a gift. Let's begin. The grand, crystal-lit showroom of L'Atelier Blanc, the city's most exclusive bridal boutique, smelled of expensive champagne and fresh white roses. The walls were lined with breathtaking, hand-stitched designer gowns that cost more than most people made in a year. For the elite brides of the city, this boutique was the ultimate destination to prove their status. For 24-year-old Sienna, it was the only place acceptable for her fairy tale wedding. Standing on a circular velvet pedestal, Sienna stared at her reflection in the massive floor-to-ceiling mirror. She was wearing a stunning, heavily beaded custom Italian silk gown. It was breathtaking. But Sienna wasn't thinking about the profound, emotional meaning of her upcoming marriage to her fiancé, Julian. She was entirely consumed by how the dress would look on her social media feed. She was obsessed with the aesthetic, desperate to project an illusion of absolute perfection and endless wealth to her thousands of followers online. Sitting on a plush velvet sofa across from the pedestal was Cora, her 30-year-old older sister. The contrast between the two sisters was absolutely jarring. While Sienna was glowing, wrapped in luxury and entitlement, Cora looked deeply exhausted. Cora was wearing a faded, sensible gray cardigan, worn-out jeans, and scuffed flat shoes. Her hands were slightly calloused from years of working double shifts. Since their parents passed away 10 years ago, Cora had completely put her own life, her own dreams, and her own happiness entirely on hold to raise Sienna. Cora had worked tirelessly to put her younger sister through a prestigious university, sacrificing everything so Sienna could have a beautiful life. Sienna twirled in the heavy silk gown, holding up her phone to record a video for her followers. "Oh my gosh, Fallon. Isn't it absolutely flawless?" Sienna squealed, looking at her toxically superficial best friend and bridesmaid, who was sitting next to Cora. Fallon, dressed in a flashy designer outfit and sipping a glass of complimentary champagne, clapped her hands dramatically. "Sienna, it is literally everything. It screams luxury. If you don't wear this down the aisle, you are officially canceling your own wedding. You have to have it." Sienna beamed, her massive ego swelling. She turned toward Cora, who was quietly holding a bridal catalog. "Well, Cora, what do you think? This is the one, right?" Cora smiled warmly, her eyes filled with genuine, unconditional love for her little sister. "You look absolutely beautiful, Sienna, like a real princess." But Cora hesitated, her eyes nervously darting to the massive, gold-embossed price tag hanging from the sleeve. "This dress is $15,000. That is an incredible amount of money." Sienna's bright, arrogant smile instantly vanished. She crossed her arms, violently offended by the mere mention of money. Cora, you literally promised you would buy my wedding dress, Sienna whined, her tone instantly dropping into that of a spoiled, entitled child. You said you had savings. I am the bride. You are my maid of honor and my older sister. It is your absolute duty to make sure I look perfect on my special day. Cora swallowed hard, nervously rubbing the fabric of her faded cardigan. It was true. Cora had been secretly saving money for 8 years. She had finally saved exactly $15,000, which she planned to use to finally open her own small bakery, her lifelong dream. She had happily promised to buy Sienna's dress, but she had assumed the dress would cost $1,000 or $2,000, not her entire life savings. But there was a much darker, far more terrifying secret hiding behind Sienna's picture-perfect aesthetic. Sienna was drowning in a suffocating ocean of student loan debt. Because of her obsession with luxury and the college experience, she had maxed out multiple high-interest, predatory private loans, totaling nearly $50,000. The interest was compounding violently every single month. Sienna was secretly hiding the massive debt from her fiancé, Julian, completely ignoring the final notices in her mail so she could focus on buying expensive flower arrangements and catering. Cora knew about the debt. She had seen the threatening letters. She knew that if Sienna entered her marriage with that massive hidden financial burden, it would absolutely destroy her and Julian's future before it even began. They would never be able to buy a house, start a family, or live in peace. Sienna, honey, Cora said softly, trying to be the voice of reason. I did promise to buy your dress, and I will. But $15,000? Maybe we could look at the dresses in the $2,000 range? There are gorgeous options. And then we could use the rest of the money to help you and Julian start your life on a clean slate. You know, with those private loans, do not talk about my loans right now. Sienna hissed aggressively, quickly looking around the boutique to make sure no one had heard the word debt. She stepped off the pedestal, her face flushed with toxic anger. Julian doesn't need to know about that yet. I am focusing on my aesthetic. This is my one special day, and I am not walking down the aisle in some cheap, pathetic discount dress just because you don't understand fashion. Fallon rolled her eyes, swirling her champagne glass and feeding Sienna's toxic delusion. Honestly, Cora, you can't put a price tag on memories. If you really loved your sister, you wouldn't be trying to cheap out on the most important day of her entire life. Cora's heart ached at the cruel accusation. She loved Sienna more than life itself. She would gladly step in front of a moving train for her. I'm not trying to be cheap, Sienna, Cora whispered softly, her eyes pleading with her sister to understand. I just want you to be safe. I want you to have a secure future. I don't need a secure future, I need a designer gown. Sienna snapped, completely blinded by her own superficiality. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at Cora. You promised to buy my dress. You have the savings. You go to the front desk right now, put down the deposit, and you pick this exact dress up next week, or I will literally never forgive you. Sienna turned her back on her sister, marching toward the dressing room with Fallon trailing closely behind, giggling maliciously. Cora sat completely alone on the velvet sofa. She looked down at her calloused hands, a deep, profound sadness settling into her chest. She had a massive, life-altering choice to make. She could give in to Sienna's toxic demands, spend her bakery savings on a meaningless piece of silk, and watch her sister's marriage collapse under the weight of predatory debt a year from now. Or, she could make the ultimate sacrifice. Cora took a deep breath, standing up from the sofa. She knew exactly what she had to do. It was going to completely break Sienna's heart in the short term, but it was the absolute only way to save her sister's life. Cora wasn't going to buy the $15,000 designer gown. She was going to buy a used, second-hand dress and quietly use her life savings to pay off the crushing student loans. But as Cora walked out of the luxurious boutique, she had absolutely no idea the level of cruel, vicious humiliation she was about to face for trying to be a loving sister. Exactly 1 week later, the grand ballroom of the Starlight Hotel was decorated with thousands of white orchids, and dripping in expensive crystal decor. Sienna was hosting her highly publicized, outrageously expensive bridal shower. She had specifically forbidden Cora from helping with the planning, insisting that her older sister's cheap taste would completely ruin the luxurious aesthetic of the event. Sienna sat at the center of the room in a plush, throne-like chair, wearing a stunning white cocktail dress and sipping imported champagne. Surrounding her were 30 of the city's most superficial, high-society women, including her toxic bridesmaid. Fallon, I am just so incredibly blessed, Sienna projected loudly to the room, making sure everyone was paying absolute attention to her. My sister is bringing my wedding dress today for the official reveal. It's a $15,000 custom Italian silk gown from L'Atelier Blanc. It is literally the most exclusive piece in the entire city. Fallon smirked, swirling her champagne. Well, you deserve it, Sienna. A queen needs a crown, and that dress is absolute perfection. I just hope Cora didn't embarrass you by showing up in one of her pathetic, worn-out sweaters. The women in the room erupted into malicious, high-pitched giggles, completely feeding Sienna's massive, toxic ego. Sienna didn't defend her sister. Instead, she flipped her hair and smiled, relishing in the attention. Suddenly, the heavy double doors of the ballroom slowly opened. The room fell completely silent as Cora walked in. Just as Fallon had maliciously predicted, Cora was wearing her faded gray cardigan, plain jeans, and scuffed flat shoes. She looked entirely out of place in the glittering, hyper-luxurious ballroom. But it wasn't her clothes that made the women gasp. It was what she was carrying. Cora was not holding a massive, gold-embossed velvet garment bag from L'Atelier Blanc. Instead, she was carrying a flimsy, slightly translucent, cheap plastic garment bag with a discount thrift store logo printed on the front. Sienna's confident, arrogant smile instantly completely vanished. Her heart dropped into her stomach. She slammed her crystal champagne glass onto a nearby table, her face flushing with a sudden, violent panic. Cora walked slowly to the center of the room, her hands trembling slightly as she held the plastic bag. She looked at her sister with deeply exhausted, yet profoundly loving eyes. Sienna, Cora said softly, her voice barely above a whisper in the dead-silent room. I brought your dress. What is that? Sienna hissed, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. She stood up from her throne, marching aggressively toward her sister. Cora, what is that plastic bag? Where is the velvet cover from the boutique? Sienna, please, just let me explain, Cora started, her eyes darting nervously to the 30 women watching them like hawks. Sienna didn't wait for an explanation. She aggressively snatched the plastic garment bag out of Cora's calloused hands and violently ripped the zipper down. The dress spilled out onto the polished ballroom floor. It was not a custom Italian silk gown. It was an outdated, slightly yellowed, intensely basic polyester dress with cheap lace trim that looked like it belonged in a 1990s catalog. To make matters infinitely worse, a small, faded neon price tag was still stapled to the hem. It read, $150 all sales final. The room erupted into shocked, muffled gasps. Fallon immediately pulled out her designer smartphone and started toxically recording the humiliating scene. Are you completely insane? Sienna screamed, her voice echoing violently off the crystal chandeliers. Tears of pure, unfiltered rage streamed down her heavily contoured face. $150? From a thrift store? You bought me a used, disgusting piece of trash for my wedding day? Cora's heart physically ached. She reached out, trying to gently touch her sister's arm. Sienna, listen to me. The designer dress was too much. I couldn't spend my entire life savings on a single piece of fabric when you have so much else to worry about. I did this to protect your future. I used the money for something you actually need. What I need is for you to not completely humiliate me in front of my friends. Sienna roared, violently slapping Cora's hand away. You promised me. You said you had the money. But you are just so incredibly selfish and jealous of my life that you decided to ruin my one special day. Jealous? Cora whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. Sienna, I practically raised you. I I gave up my 20s so you could go to college. Everything I do to make sure you are safe. Don't play the victim, Cora. Sienna snarled, her toxic entitlement entirely blinding her to the devastating pain in her older sister's eyes. You are just a cheap, pathetic loser who works double shifts because you have zero ambition. You couldn't handle the fact that I am marrying into a wealthy family and leaving you behind in your miserable, poor little life. The absolute cruelty of Sienna's words struck Cora like a physical blow to the chest. She took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. Deep in the pocket of her faded cardigan, Cora's fingers were tightly clutching a printed bank receipt, the receipt proving that just 2 hours ago, she had completely drained her $15,000 bakery fund to permanently wipe out the most predatory of Sienna's high-interest student loans. She had quite literally sacrificed her only dream to save Sienna from financial ruin. But Cora didn't pull the receipt out. She didn't defend herself. Because true, unconditional love sometimes requires taking the absolute worst of the pain, even when the person hurting you doesn't understand. You are a toxic, miserable sister, Sienna spat, picking up the cheap polyester dress and violently throwing it directly into Cora's chest. You are no longer my maid of honor. In fact, you are completely out of the wedding. Do not come to the rehearsal, and do not show your face at my ceremony. Get out of my sight. Fallon and the other superficial women nodded in agreement, glaring at Cora with absolute disgust. Cora held the cheap dress against her chest, silent tears streaming down her pale cheeks. She gave Sienna one final, deeply heartbroken look, a look not of anger, but of profound pity for the deeply superficial woman her little sister had become. I hope one day you understand, Cora whispered softly. Cora turned around and slowly walked out of the grand ballroom, the heavy double doors slamming shut behind her. Sienna was left standing in the center of the room, fuming with toxic anger, entirely convinced she was the victim. But as she picked up her champagne glass to toast to her ruined aesthetic, Sienna had absolutely no idea that she had just violently banished the only person in the entire world who actually loved her enough to save her life. The countdown to Sienna's ultimate reality check had officially begun. 6 agonizing months had passed since the day Sienna violently banished her older sister from her life. She had gotten exactly what she wanted. She had marched down the aisle in the spectacular $15,000 Italian silk gown, taking hundreds of perfectly filtered photos for her social media followers. Her wedding had appeared to be an absolute, flawless fairy tale. But behind the expensive filters, Sienna's reality had rapidly become a suffocating, inescapable nightmare. To buy the $15,000 designer dress after kicking Cora out, Sienna had secretly opened 2 massive, high-interest credit cards in her own name. She convinced herself she would figure out how to pay them off later, entirely consumed by her need to look perfect. But secrets have a brutal way of demanding to be heard. Just 2 months into their marriage, Julian had discovered the hidden credit card statements buried in the bottom of Sienna's designer handbag. Julian was a wealthy man. But he was also deeply principled and absolutely despised financial deception. When he realized Sienna had secretly plunged herself into massive debt just to buy a piece of silk she would only wear for 6 hours, he was completely furious. He didn't just refuse to pay the debt, he immediately froze all of her access to his accounts, confiscated her luxury vehicle, and issued a devastating ultimatum. Sienna had to get a job and pay off the $15,000 dress entirely on her own, or he would instantly file for divorce. Now, sitting on a hard plastic seat near the back of a crowded city transit bus, Sienna stared blankly out the smudged window. She was no longer wearing custom designer clothes or getting her hair professionally styled every week. She was wearing a plain, slightly wrinkled gray suit from a discount store. Her diamond-encrusted smartphone had a cracked screen because she couldn't afford to fix it. When she had tearfully reached out to her toxic bridesmaid Fallon, begging for a small loan to keep her credit score from tanking, Fallon had simply laughed, blocked her number, and completely cut her out of their wealthy social circle. Sienna was entirely alone, drowning under the crushing, suffocating weight of the very superficiality she had worshipped. The bus screeched to a halt in the city's upscale arts district. Sienna stepped off, pulling her thin coat tight against the chilly autumn wind. She was absolutely desperate. Her first massive minimum payment was due in 3 days, and if she missed it, Julian would find out, and the divorce papers would be signed. She had spent the last 2 weeks aggressively applying for high-paying corporate jobs, completely believing her aesthetic made her overqualified. But with no real work experience and a toxic, entitled attitude, every single company had rejected her. Now she was forced to swallow her massive pride. She had secured an interview for a basic, minimum-wage cashier position at a brand-new, wildly popular artisanal bakery that had just opened downtown. Sienna walked down the cobblestone street and stopped in front of a gorgeous, massive storefront with gleaming gold lettering on the window, the Golden Crumb. The bakery was breathtaking. The display windows were filled with exquisite, high-end pastries, delicate macarons, and multi-tiered custom cakes. The interior smelled of warm vanilla and rich espresso. It was entirely packed with wealthy patrons laughing and sipping lattes. It was exactly the kind of luxurious place Sienna used to visit when she thought she was untouchable. Now, she was walking in to beg for a name tag. Sienna pushed open the heavy glass doors, instantly feeling incredibly small and pathetic in her discount suit. She nervously approached the sleek marble front counter, where a young, cheerful barista was wiping down the espresso machine. "Excuse me," Sienna mumbled, looking down at her scuffed shoes to avoid eye contact with the wealthy customers behind her. "I have a 2 o'clock interview for the cashier position. With the owner." The barista smiled warmly. "Of course. Let me go grab her from the kitchen. She's just finishing up a custom wedding cake. Be right back." Sienna stood awkwardly near the register, her heart pounding with a toxic mixture of anxiety and deep, bitter resentment. She hated that her life had come to this. She hated Julian for forcing her to work. And most of all, she still intensely hated her older sister Cora, entirely blaming her for this entire financial disaster. If Cora had just bought the dress like she promised, Sienna wouldn't be begging for minimum wage. Suddenly, the heavy stainless steel kitchen doors swung open. "Sorry to keep you waiting," a bright, highly professional female voice echoed from behind the counter. "I was just doing the final sugar work on a top-tier order." "It's so nice to meet you. I'm the owner." The woman stopped completely dead in her tracks. Sienna slowly looked up from her scuffed shoes, bringing on her fake, practiced customer service smile. But the absolute second her eyes locked onto the owner of the luxury bakery, the smile violently shattered. All the air instantly vanished from her lungs. Her face drained of all color, turning as pale as a sheet. Standing behind the marble counter was Cora. But this was not the deeply exhausted, financially struggling sister Sienna had viciously humiliated 6 months ago. Cora was not wearing a faded gray cardigan or plain, worn-out jeans. Cora was wearing a crisp, immaculate, custom-embroidered executive chef's coat. Her hair was neatly pinned back, her skin was glowing with radiant health, and she projected an aura of absolute confidence, immense success, and deep, unshakable peace. Sienna's knees literally buckled, forcing her to grab the edge of the marble counter to stay standing. The crushing, entirely incomprehensible reality of the situation violently slammed into her brain. "Cora?" Sienna gasped, her voice a pathetic, choked whisper. You own this place? The Golden Crumb?" Cora looked at her younger sister. She saw the cheap, wrinkled suit. She saw the profound exhaustion and raw panic in Sienna's eyes. Cora's expression remained perfectly calm, completely void of the toxic anger Sienna usually projected. "Hello, Sienna," Cora said softly, her powerful, grounded voice cutting through the bustling noise of the bakery. "Yes, I am the sole owner." "But how?" Sienna blurted out, her toxic entitlement temporarily overriding her sheer panic. Her voice grew louder, drawing the attention of a few nearby customers. "6 months ago, you brought me a cheap, disgusting $150 piece of trash from a thrift store. You told me you didn't have the money to buy my silk dress. How on earth did you afford a multi-million-dollar bakery in the arts district?" Sienna's mind was spinning out of control. She felt completely betrayed all over again. In her deeply superficial mind, Cora had hoarded a massive fortune just to intentionally ruin Sienna's wedding, only to spend the money on herself. Cora took a slow, deep breath. She looked at the deeply broken, miserable woman standing on the other side of the counter. She knew exactly why Sienna was standing there in a cheap suit, looking for a minimum wage job, and she knew that the devastating truth she was about to reveal would completely shatter the fragile glass house Sienna had built her entire life upon. "I didn't have the money for the bakery 6 months ago, Sienna," Cora said quietly, leaning slightly over the marble counter. "And I didn't have the money for your silk dress, because of what I had done exactly 2 hours before your bridal shower." The bustling, sweet-smelling atmosphere of the Golden Crumb seemed to fade entirely into the background as Sienna stared in absolute wide-eyed horror at her older sister. Her mind frantically tried to process the impossible reality. Cora, the sister she had relentlessly mocked for being poor and unambitious, was standing in a custom executive chef's coat, radiating immense success in a bakery that clearly cost millions of dollars to open. "What do you mean?" Sienna demanded, her voice shaking violently. "What did you do 2 hours before my bridal shower, Cora? If you didn't buy this bakery with the money you promised me, then where did my $15,000 go?" Cora's expression remained profoundly calm, though a deep, lingering sorrow flashed in her eyes. She reached under the pristine marble counter and pulled out a sleek leather binder. She opened it, entirely ignoring Sienna's aggressive tone, and pulled out a single, heavily creased piece of paper. It was the exact same piece of paper Cora had been clutching in her faded cardigan 6 months ago, when Sienna had violently thrown the cheap polyester dress at her chest. Cora placed the paper on the marble counter and slid it slowly toward her younger sister. "Read it, Sienna." Sienna aggressively snatched the paper, fully expecting it to be a massive business loan or a secret investment Cora had hidden from her. But as her eyes scanned the bold black text at the top of the page, her heart completely stopped beating. It was a final statement from Apex Financial, the predatory private loan company that held Sienna's suffocating $50,000 student debt. Sienna's hands began to tremble violently as she read the numbers. The paper confirmed a one-time, lump sum settlement payment of exactly $15,000, and at the very bottom of the page, stamped in bright, undeniable red ink, were the words, "Account paid in full. Balance, $0. The payment date was exactly 6 months ago. 2 hours before Sienna's bridal shower. The air violently left Sienna's lungs. The heavy, crushing reality of the document slammed into her chest with the force of a freight train. "You," Sienna gasped, the paper shaking furiously in her hands. "You paid off my student loans? All of them?" "You were drowning, Sienna," Cora said quietly, her voice carrying a heavy, devastating weight. "I saw the final notices you were hiding in the trash. I saw that the interest was compounding so fast that within a year, they were going to garnish your wages and freeze Julian's assets the second you got married. That debt was going to completely destroy your marriage before it even started." Sienna's perfectly practiced customer service smile shattered into a million pieces. A cold, suffocating sweat broke out across her forehead. "I had been saving that $15,000 for 8 years to open this bakery," Cora continued, her piercing eyes locking onto Sienna's terrified face. "It was my entire life savings. But when you demanded that I spend it on a single piece of silk you would wear for 6 hours, I knew I had to make a choice. I could give you the superficial aesthetic you wanted, or I could buy you your freedom. So, I went to the bank, drained my bakery fund, and negotiated a final settlement to wipe your debt completely clean." Sienna's knees buckled again, and this time, she couldn't stop herself from falling. She dropped to her knees right there on the polished floor of the bakery, her cheap, wrinkled suit pooling around her. "I bought you the $150 thrift store dress because it was literally the only money I had left to my name," Cora whispered, a single tear escaping her eye. "I sacrificed my only dream to make sure you could start your new life completely safe. And in return, you humiliated me in front of 30 people, threw the dress in my face, and banished me from your life." The absolute, devastating irony of the situation violently crushed Sienna's soul. If Sienna had just swallowed her toxic pride, if she had just worn the cheap polyester dress down the aisle, she would have entered her marriage completely debt-free. She would have had a loving husband, a perfect life, and the unconditional support of her sister. Instead, entirely blinded by her own massive ego, Sienna had kicked Cora out and secretly maxed out high-interest credit cards just to buy the designer gown herself. She had literally ruined her own life, driven her husband to the brink of divorce, and plunged herself into massive credit card debt, all while her older sister had already secretly saved her from the original student loans. But the bakery. Sienna sobbed hysterically, tears ruining her face as she looked up at the glittering chandeliers of the Golden Crumb. "How do you have this if you gave me all your money?" "Karma," Cora said simply. "The day after your wedding, a local angel investor came into the diner where I was working my double shifts. He tasted one of my homemade pastries. We got to talking, and I told him my story, how I had to delay my dream because my family needed me. He was so moved by my work ethic that he fully funded this entire bakery, completely out of pocket. He said good people deserve to win." Sienna completely broke down, crying hysterically into her hands. The entire bakery was dead silent. Every wealthy patron watching the entitled woman absolutely shatter under the weight of her own cruelty. "Cora, please," Sienna wailed, reaching her trembling hands up to grab the edge of the marble counter. "I am so incredibly sorry. I was so blind. Julian found the credit cards I used to buy the wedding dress. He cut me off. If I don't get a job and pay the massive minimum payment by Friday, he is going to divorce me and I will have absolutely nothing. Please, Cora. You have to hire me. I'll be the cashier. I'll clean the floors. Just please save me again." Cora looked down at her weeping younger sister. Her heart ached, but the years of enduring Sienna's toxic, ungrateful abuse had finally taught Cora an invaluable lesson about boundaries. She felt absolutely no obligation to save a woman who had built her entire existence on superficial cruelty. "I love you, Sienna," Cora said softly, stepping back from the counter. "And I always will. But true love doesn't always look like what you asked for. It looks like what you needed. I gave you the ultimate clean slate, and you threw it away for a piece of silk. I cannot hire you." Sienna gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been physically shot. "Why?" "Because my bakery is built on hard work, humility, and absolute respect for everyone who walks through these doors," Cora said with devastating finality. "And those are 3 things you know absolutely nothing about." Sienna remained entirely frozen on her knees, on the polished floor of the Golden Crumb, the devastating weight of Cora's final words violently crushing the last of her massive ego. The wealthy patrons in the bakery, who had stopped drinking their lattes to watch the dramatic confrontation, stared down at Sienna with unfiltered disgust. Sienna reached her trembling hands out, desperately trying to grab the sleeve of Cora's pristine executive chef's coat. "Please, Cora, you are my sister," Sienna wailed, her voice cracking violently as mascara streamed down her face. "You are supposed to protect me. If you don't help me, I am going to lose everything." Cora slowly stepped back, completely out of Sienna's reach. She looked at her younger sister not with anger, but with a profound, unshakable pity. "I did protect you, Sienna," Cora whispered softly. "I gave you the greatest gift I possibly could. But you chose to worship a price tag instead of valuing my sacrifice. You made this bed out of absolute greed and toxic pride. Now, you have to sleep in it." Without another word, Cora turned her back on her weeping sister and walked calmly back through the heavy stainless steel kitchen doors, leaving Sienna entirely alone. Sienna was utterly destroyed. She slowly stood up, her cheap, wrinkled discount suit clinging to her shaking frame, with the entire bakery silently watching her humiliating defeat. Sienna stumbled out the heavy glass doors and into the freezing autumn rain. The consequences of Sienna's toxic superficiality arrived exactly 3 days later. Friday morning came, and Sienna completely missed the massive minimum payment on the secret, high-interest credit cards she had used to buy the $15,000 wedding dress. When the bank aggressively called the penthouse, Julian answered the phone. Julian's reaction was absolute and merciless. He didn't yell, he didn't argue, he simply packed all of Sienna's belongings into cheap black trash bags, confiscated the luxury SUV he had bought her, and handed her a signed stack of divorce papers. "You lied to me," Julian said coldly, standing in the doorway of the sprawling penthouse as Sienna sobbed on the hallway floor. "You plunged us into massive debt for a meaningless piece of silk, and you violently alienated the only family member who actually cared about you. I do not stay married to toxic, superficial liars." The heavy oak door of the penthouse slammed shut, locking Sienna out of the luxurious fairy tale life she had literally sacrificed her own soul to achieve. To pay the aggressive credit card collectors, Sienna was forced to completely swallow her pride and sell the beautiful, custom Italian silk gown. But luxury items lose their value the second they are worn. She dragged the heavy gown to a high-end consignment shop, only to be completely humiliated when they offered her a mere $1,500 for the sweat-stained, used dress. It barely covered a single month of the compounding interest. 1 year later, the harsh, fluorescent lights of City Express dry cleaners buzzed with a dull, highly annoying hum. It was 8 p.m. on a Friday night, and the small, suffocatingly hot shop smelled strongly of harsh chemicals and industrial steam. Standing behind the ironing board, violently pressing a massive, heavy bridal gown, was Sienna. Her life had become a relentless, inescapable nightmare of absolute karma. She was wearing a cheap, heavily stained blue uniform. Her hands, which used to be perfectly manicured, were now calloused, burnt from the hot steam, and deeply scarred exactly like Cora's hands used to be. Sienna was working exhausting double shifts just to survive in a tiny, cramped apartment while frantically sending every extra penny to the credit card company to pay off a dress she didn't even own anymore. As she aggressively pushed the heavy iron over the silk fabric of a stranger's wedding gown, her red, exhausted eyes drifted toward the small, static-filled television mounted in the corner of the dry cleaners. Playing on the local news was a live lifestyle segment titled "The City's Sweetest Success." The camera panned across the beautiful, sparkling interior of the Golden Crumb. There, standing behind the pastry case, was Cora. She looked breathtakingly radiant, her skin glowing with profound happiness and peace. But she wasn't standing alone. Beside her was Elias, a handsome, incredibly kind-hearted man who co-managed the bakery with her. He was holding Cora's hand, looking at her with genuine, unwavering love and absolute respect. The news anchor smiled brightly. "Cora, your bakery has become a multi-million-dollar empire in just a year, and we hear congratulations are in order for you and Elias on your recent engagement." Cora blushed, holding up her hand to reveal a modest, entirely sensible, yet beautiful engagement ring. "Thank you," Cora smiled warmly. "I am incredibly blessed." "We have to ask," the anchor laughed. "As a highly successful CEO, what high-end designer are you choosing for your wedding dress?" Cora squeezed Elias's hand, looking directly into the camera with a profound, knowing peace in her eyes. "Actually," Cora said softly, "I found a beautiful, vintage dress at a local thrift store for about $200. Elias and I believe that a wedding isn't about the price tag of the clothes you wear or the aesthetic you project. It's about the love, the loyalty, and the sacrifices you are willing to make for each other. True value doesn't have a barcode." In the dingy, suffocating dry cleaners, Sienna dropped the heavy iron. She stared at the television screen, tears of deep, agonizing regret violently streaming down her tired face. The crushing weight of her massive mistake settled permanently into her bones. She had thrown away the ultimate, life-saving gift, completely destroyed her own marriage, and alienated a sister who loved her unconditionally, all for a toxic illusion of wealth. Sienna collapsed onto a plastic chair in the back of the shop, weeping into her calloused hands. She finally understood the brutal, life-altering truth. True class and genuine wealth are never determined by the designer label on your back, but by the love and gratitude in your heart. It was a devastating lesson learned far too late, and Sienna would spend the rest of her life paying the price, completely forgotten by the glittering world she once thought she ruled. The lesson from this story: when we become entirely obsessed with our outward appearance and the superficial aesthetic of our lives, we often go completely blind to the quiet, profound sacrifices made by the people who truly love us. True family and genuine love don't always arrive in a shiny box with a designer label. Sometimes, the most priceless gifts in the world are disguised as the simplest gestures. When you judge the people who love you based purely on what they can buy for you, you risk losing the absolute only thing money can never buy: genuine, unconditional loyalty. Every moment has a meaning, but not every truth is easy to face. If this lesson resonated with you, hit the like button and subscribe. Comment value over price below if you believe that the sacrifices our loved ones make for us are far more important than any designer label. This is Moments and Meanings by Anne, and I'll see you in the next story.